No headings, pure narrative. There is a kind of silence that follows a man after everything falls apart, not the peaceful kind. The kind that follows you into rooms, that sits across from you at breakfast, that never says a word but never leaves either. Matt Lauer knew that silence well. For over 2 decades, he was the face that America woke up to. The calm voice in the early morning dark, the easy smile across a desk that felt somehow like it had always been there. He was dependable the way sunrise is dependable, so consistent, so present that you stopped noticing, you just counted on it. And then in a matter of hours he was gone, not retired. Not transitioned out with a montage and a farewell cake. Gone, the way a candle goes out in a wind you never heard coming. The statement NBC released on November 29, 2017 was short and clinical. It said that Matt Lauer's employment had been terminated following a detailed complaint of inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace. That was it. No warning for viewers. No goodbye clip. No handshake at the door, just a sentence, and then an empty chair. Savannah Guthrie sat at that same desk the very next morning and told the world what had happened. Her voice cracked on live television, her eyes filled. She called him her dear, dear friend. And then, because that is what morning television demands, she kept going. For years, the story seemed finished. The names were known. The verdict of public opinion had been delivered with the kind of finality that the internet rarely reverses. But at 68, Matt Lauer is still here. And according to recent reports and accounts that have surfaced over the past several years, he is not finished talking. What he has chosen to say, and who has chosen to respond, is where this story takes a turn that almost no one fully expected. To understand where Matt Lauer is now, you have to go back to what he actually was. Not just the fame, not just the ratings, but the specific and unusual kind of trust that morning television builds between a host and an audience, something quieter and more intimate than most people stop to examine. It is a different kind of trust than what you give a news anchor at night or a late-night host at 11. Morning television comes to you when you are still half asleep. When your coffee hasn't finished brewing, when the day hasn't yet asked anything of you at all. In that soft and vulnerable window of the early morning, a familiar face carries unusual weight. You don't choose it consciously, it just settles in. Matt Lauer occupied that space for 23 years on the Today Show, and for much of that time, by almost any professional measure, he was considered one of the best at it. He could shift from a light-hearted Halloween costume segment to a sit-down with a world leader without losing momentum. He could make a celebrity feel comfortable and a senator feel genuinely cornered in the same broadcast hour. He had range, he had control. And he had, by every industry standard that mattered, enormous influence over the people watching him. He was born in New York City in 1957, and his path to morning television was not immediate or obvious. He spent years in smaller markets, building his craft quietly and without fanfare, before arriving at Today in 1994. By the early 2000s, he was among the highest-paid figures in American broadcasting, his contracts reportedly placing him among the top earners across all of network television. There was a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. There was a life that, from the outside, looked like something from a carefully designed dream assembled piece by piece, polished at every edge. His marriage to Annette Roque, a Dutch model he wed in 1998, produced 3 children. The family appeared, on its surface, stable in the way that public lives can appear stable when the cameras are always on and the narrative is always controlled. There were magazine profiles. There were charity galas. There were the annual Today traditions, the Halloween costumes, the holiday specials that made him feel like a permanent fixture not just of the show, but of American mornings themselves. Colleagues described him in those years in glowing terms that sometimes carried a quiet asterisk. Charming, yes, talented without question. But also, according to some who worked alongside him over many years, someone who understood exactly how much power he held, and did not always seem to forget it when the cameras were off. Still, for the vast majority of his run, the public image held, the ratings held, the trust held. That is what made November 2017 feel, for so many people, like the floor had quietly given way beneath something they never thought to question. There is something particular about people who live their professional lives in front of cameras. Over time, the performance and the person begin to blur, not just in the minds of the audience, but sometimes in the mind of the performer himself. The version of you that the world sees every morning becomes its own kind of reality. It develops weight. It develops history. It carries expectations that follow you into every room, even the ones with no cameras. Matt Lauer had built a life exactly like that, carefully layered, polished at every visible edge. And for a long time, it held together in ways that seemed almost effortless, which is, in retrospect, its own kind of warning sign. In the years leading up to 2017, the Today Show had already endured its own quiet turbulence. Ann Curry's emotional and deeply controversial departure in 2012 had left a mark on the show's internal reputation that lingered long after the headlines faded. Questions were raised at the time about power dynamics within the program, about who held it and how. Matt Lauer's role in that situation was discussed in media circles, though he largely stayed above the public conversation and the show moved forward. He moved forward. By 2017, the program was still one of the most watched morning broadcasts in the country. He was conducting major interviews. He was, by every external measure, firmly in place. Untouchable in the way that longevity creates its own kind of armor, but something was shifting in the broader culture. Slowly at first, and then with a speed that caught nearly everyone off guard. The autumn of 2017 brought a reckoning that had been quietly building for decades. Stories that had been whispered in industry hallways began breaking into daylight, name after name. Industry after industry, the weight of long-held silence cracked under its own accumulated pressure. And inside NBC, according to subsequent reporting by outlets including Ronan Farrow, questions were being raised behind closed doors that the public had not yet been allowed to hear. Matt Lauer was still on air, still smiling, still anchoring. The life he had constructed looked exactly as it always had, and then it didn't. November 29, 2017 began like most mornings. And ended unlike any morning before it or since. By the time most viewers sat down with their coffee, the statement had already been issued. Matt Lauer had been fired. His 23 years at the Today Show were over. And the explanation, a detailed complaint of inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace, was specific enough to alarm and vague enough to leave enormous questions unanswered. It landed in the world like something dropped from a great height. Savannah Guthrie and Hoda Kotb sat at that desk the following morning and delivered the news themselves. By any measure, it was one of the most quietly devastating moments in the history of morning television. Savannah Guthrie's voice broke when she said his name. She said she was heartbroken. She said she was still processing. She said that what he was accused of was a complete betrayal of the values she believed they both stood for. That moment, a woman speaking honestly about grief and anger in real time, on live television, with nowhere to hide, struck something deep in the people watching. It felt unrehearsed in a medium that almost never is. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Ronan Farrow published a deeply reported account in The New Yorker, in which multiple women described encounters with Matt Lauer that they said were non-consensual or profoundly inappropriate. One account described a specific incident at the 2014 Sochi Olympics. Others described what they characterized as a pattern of behavior, one that, according to reports, may have been known or at least suspected by people close to the program at NBC. Matt Lauer denied many of the specific allegations. He issued a statement acknowledging that some of his behavior in the workplace had been inappropriate, while pushing back against what he described as the most egregious of the claims. NBC, for its part, faced serious questions about what it had known and when. Investigators were brought in. Reports were issued. But many of those reports, according to critics including some of the women involved, fell short of full transparency. The findings raised more questions than they answered. The public absorbed the information in waves. Shock first, then something more complicated, something that didn't have a clean name, because this was not a story about a stranger. This was about someone who had been in the room every single morning. The years that came after were quiet by design, or at least, they appeared that way on the surface. Matt Lauer retreated from public life almost entirely. Properties were sold. He kept a profile so low it was nearly invisible. The media covered his absence the way it covers most falls from grace. Intensely at first, and then in the rearview mirror in smaller and smaller pieces. As new crises replaced old ones in a cycle that never really stops. But behind that silence, according to people close to him and to reporting that surfaced gradually over time, the man was not simply waiting for things to blow over. He was, in his own way, processing, rebuilding, and depending on who you ask, reconsidering what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. His marriage to Annette Roque ended in divorce in 2019. The separation had reportedly been a subject of discussion even before the firing. But the events of late 2017 accelerated the formal end of something that had already been fracturing quietly for years. Their three children remained a central focus. And by some accounts, the experience of losing everything very publicly, career, reputation, many friendships. The entire daily structure of a life built around television had done something to him that is genuinely difficult to describe cleanly. There were occasional sightings, a local restaurant on Long Island, brief appearances in the periphery of someone else's story. He was living something that looked from the outside like a quiet life, but quietness and peace are not the same thing. And people who knew him in those years described someone who was not simply at rest. He was thinking, writing, preparing in some form for something he had not yet done. What he was preparing for became clearer only gradually, because the women who had spoken out about him did not stop speaking. Brooke Neville's, one of the women identified in Ronan Farrow's original reporting, gave a deeply detailed account in 2019 that described what she said was a rape at the Sochi Olympics. Matt Lauer called that account a lie. The disagreement was not subtle or measured. It was direct and complete, two irreconcilable versions of the same event placed into public view with no resolution between them. No charges were filed. No legal verdict was reached. But the weight of that dispute settled over everything that followed, and it did not lift. There is a particular kind of decision that public figures make after a fall of this magnitude. Some go silent and stay silent. Some pursue carefully managed interviews to begin the long process of rehabilitation. Some write books. Some wait for the cultural weather to shift and hope that time does quietly what lawyers and publicists cannot do openly. According to reports that emerged over the years following his termination, Matt Lauer chose something different. He began speaking, not on a wide media tour, not with a publicist-approved script, but in ways that were, for someone who had maintained near total silence, notably direct, and notably willing to challenge the account of him that had hardened into public record. Questions have been raised about the nature and extent of some of the allegations. According to various accounts, Lauer reportedly maintained, consistently and at some personal risk, that the most serious claims against him were either false or were missing critical context that changed their meaning entirely. This is not a small claim, and it is not offered here as settled fact. No official conclusion has been reached. What is documented is that he made it, repeatedly. And that some people who had once stood firmly against him began, in small and quiet ways, to complicate the story, not to exonerate him, but to introduce nuance where none had previously existed in public conversation. The cultural ecosystem around the Me Too movement had also shifted in texture by this point. Not in its foundational importance, which remained widely affirmed, but in the way certain individual cases were being re-examined with more caution. Courts had overturned convictions in some high-profile cases. Questions about due process and evidentiary standards had entered the mainstream conversation in ways they had not in 2017. Writers and thinkers who fully and genuinely supported accountability for sexual misconduct were also asking, more openly, what accountability should look like case by case, and what standards of evidence should apply before judgment becomes permanent. Matt Lauer existed somewhere in the center of all of that, a figure too large to forget and too contested, apparently, to fully resolve. And then came the question of Savannah Guthrie. Savannah Guthrie had moved on in the most professional and most deeply human sense of that phrase. She had done the work of continuing when continuing must have felt nearly impossible. She had carried the Today Show through the aftermath of one of its most painful chapters. She had spoken with raw honesty on that November morning and had then, day after day, shown up and performed the job she was hired to do without the luxury of visible collapse. But questions about her relationship with Matt Lauer, not romantic, but professional and personal in the way that genuine long friendships become woven into a person, never fully disappeared from the conversation surrounding him. She had called him her dear, dear friend on live television with a cracking voice and nowhere to hide. She had broken in a way that was unmistakably real. And over the years, various profiles and pieces of reporting had touched on the genuine difficulty of her position. Someone who had grieved the loss of a colleague, while simultaneously absorbing the weight of what she had learned about him. Those two things, the grief and the horror, do not resolve each other. They live side by side. When Lauer began speaking again, publicly, in ways that reached the broader media ecosystem, Savannah Guthrie's name inevitably appeared in the surrounding coverage, not as an accuser, not as a defender, but as someone whose response, or deliberate lack of visible public response, carried its own meaning to the people who had watched her break in real time. According to reports, Guthrie has navigated the years since with a kind of careful restraint that speaks to someone who genuinely understands that there is no clean or comfortable answer to be given. She has not publicly defended him, she has not publicly attacked him. She has simply continued with professionalism and, by most available accounts, genuine dignity. But the question underneath all of the coverage is not really about her public statements or the absence of them. It is about something quieter and more fundamentally human. It is about what it means to have cared deeply for someone who turned out to be, in at least some significant part, other than who you believed them to be. It is about whether grief and anger can live together in the same room, without one eventually consuming the other. About whether 20 years of real friendship can survive the full weight of what gets revealed about a person when the structure around them collapses. There is no easy answer to that. And it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What is clear is that Matt Lauer, at 68 years removed from that desk, from that salary, from the particular kind of identity that daily television provides, is still unresolved. Not legally. Not publicly. Not emotionally, in the way his name still carries visible charge when it enters a conversation. He speaks now from somewhere entirely outside the structure that once held him and defined him. Whether what he says from this point changes anything, for the women involved, for the public record, for himself, is a question that does not yet have an answer. There is a specific kind of weight that comes with watching a constructed life come completely apart. It is not clean. It is not satisfying, even when accountability feels long overdue and deeply necessary. It is complicated in ways that the initial headlines, the ones that define how most people still understand the story, never quite managed to capture. Matt Lauer was not simply a television host. He was a kind of daily companion for millions of people who had never met him and never would. That is what morning television does at its most effective. It builds a form of intimacy that is entirely one-sided and yet somehow feels completely real. And when that intimacy is shattered by revelation, the grief that follows is genuine, even when it sits uncomfortably alongside other emotions that are also genuine. The women who came forward carried something real. Their accounts, whatever the legal status of any individual claim, described experiences that shaped their lives in ways that time has not erased. That is not a small thing. That does not diminish because years have passed or because the cultural moment that first gave their stories visibility has moved forward into other stories, other names. And yet the story of Matt Lauer, like so many stories that emerged from that particular era, refuses to collapse neatly into something simple. The questions he continues to raise, carefully and with evident awareness of the stakes involved, sit in public space without resolution. The absence of legal findings does not settle the human questions. It simply leaves them open where they wait. Savannah Guthrie, in her continued presence and her chosen public silence about all of this, might actually be saying something more honest than any statement could allow. Some situations cannot be neatly resolved in public without betraying the private truth of them. Some grief belongs entirely to the person experiencing it, not to the audience watching from outside and wanting a conclusion. At 68, a man who once had everything looks at what remains and tries to figure out what to do with it. That is a profoundly human moment, regardless of everything, all of it, that brought him there. The reckoning, the silence, the years of choosing what to say and to whom, the decision finally to start talking, whether what he says changes anything is not yet known. Whether the women who spoke will ever feel heard in the way they deserve, fully, completely, without the noise, is not yet known. What is known is that the story is not finished. And stories that are not finished tend to return quietly and persistently until they find something that resembles an ending. That ending has not arrived. If something in this story made you pause, made you think about memory or accountability, or the distance between who someone appears to be and who they actually are, share that thought in the comments. These conversations deserve more than a headline and a verdict. If you want to keep exploring stories like this one with the same care and the same honesty, the subscribe button is there when you're ready. We'll be here.